Welcome back to this week's episode of Mystery Garage. Today's episode, we're going to tear down the ABA, start talking about all things ABF, and pulling together all the parts that I have to build the ABF. So lots of work ahead of us, let's get to it. Alright, welcome back to this week's episode of Mystery Garage. So in last week's episode, we got the ABA up on the engine stand. I got carried away with all the excitement of the new parts I got from Fast Bunny Metalworks. So we didn't get down to tearing this motor apart, but that's what I want to do in today's episode. So what I figure we're going to do is we're going to, as we start pulling this motor apart, we'll start separating the parts onto the floor behind me here of what we're going to keep and what we're going to use in the ABF build. I'm also going to go into storage and quickly grab some of the 9A 2-liter 16 valve parts that we're going to add to the floor and kind of start to assemble the build more or less on the floor and kind of highlight the parts that I'm going to need to order in order to make that happen. We're also going to talk a little bit about the nuts and the bolts of an ABF conversion or an ABF clone. Again, this isn't going to be an exact replica of the ABF, mainly because I am going to go carbureted, which for most ABFs, they stick with the injection. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, talk about what parts I am going to keep, what parts I'm not going to keep, and eventually at the end of the day, hopefully have most of an ABF built here on the floor, or at least laid out on the floor, and then we'll talk about kind of the plan to assemble it all together. So let's get to work. Now before we get into this build, or at least the formatting of laying this all out, I want to quickly have a disclaimer. With building an ABF clone, there's a lot of different ways to get it done. So I'm going to kind of lay out a few different options and tell you the ways I'm going to go. For any of you out there who really want to find out other methods or other things you can do to build a clone ABF, by all means hit the internet. There's tons of different forums and conversations about what other people did to achieve different things, whether that's compression choice or by piston selection or what have you, or what inner parts of the bottom end you want to keep or use from either a 9A or the ABA, or look externally for other parts like stroker motors or what have you. Those are all options too, but I'm just going to, this is a budget channel. I kind of want to do a budget build and show you as many Volkswagen parts that I already have to build the motor with, and then kind of just slowly buy the stuff that I kind of have to. So that's new gaskets, obviously head gasket, engine gaskets. I want to build the motor properly, so we'll probably put a new water pump on it, new alternator, all those kinds of things to make sure this lasts the test of time. But at the same time, trying to save and build this on a budget, so hopefully you guys can replicate something very similar. Like I said, a big distinction of what I'm going to do versus an ABF clone is I am going to run carburetors, so a lot of the injection conversation, the management conversation, fuel system conversation, all changes when you say the word carburetor, because there's a lot of different things that happen when you go that route. So I'm going to basically show you how to build, what I would more or less call a long block. So excluding fuel management, we're going to build the short block, the head, and assemble all those parts, not in this episode, but in a coming episode very shortly, to build basically the long block of an ABA, and then you can choose to go from there, an ABF, but you can choose to go from there of which way you want to fuel it, whether you want to go fuel injection, whether you want to stay CIS, or going to go into something else electronic, or find some sort of management system for it. There are Volkswagen management systems you can use, and there are third-party management systems you can use. So again, big can of worms, lots of choices here, but I'm just going to show you what I'm going to do. So let's get to it. All right, there we are. So the 2-liter ABA is now torn down. It was really easy. If you guys want to look back and see kind of how a motor's torn down, you're welcome to go back and look at the 16 valve episode. It's crazy how much these motors are similar. A lot of the components, especially on the block, are a lot the same. Maybe a little newer, a little different, but essentially the way they bolt on is exactly the same. So taking a look at this engine, I'm very happy with the cylinder walls. There's no scoring at all. There's no real issues there. So a quick little cleanup. This block would be in great shape. As you can see here, the coolant passages, I don't know if you remember in the 9A, actually I can probably show you in a little bit. All in here was all rusty and corroded and we were full of corrosion. So this block is a lot better block to be using. I don't know if you can see that, the internals there, very clean. I'll show you the underside when we get there. I took out the intermediate shaft. Again, inside the engine, very clean, no real issues. You can see the outside of the block is actually quite filthy, but that's all stuff we can tend to. That's just the aesthetics. It's got nothing to do with the operation of the engine. So over to the other parts I have. As you can see, there's a ton of stuff I'm not using. I will be plucking some of the things out of this pile when we go to put everything together on the floor, but you can see I took off the whole head assembly as one, exhaust manifold, intake manifold, injectors. I left everything together. There's no sense in me breaking it down, so I'm not going to be using any of those parts anyways. You go through, there's the ignition, distributor, upper intake manifold. I will be using this part. This is the ABA serpentine belt system. For the alternator and that sort of thing. There's the intermediate shaft from the ABA. Anyway, so we're at the point here where the block's more or less not fully torn down, but pretty torn down. I do need some parts out of my ABA, but I got stuff back there. I'll grab that right now and we'll get to work pulling some stuff off that. Okay, bear with me here. I want to show you one thing, which is a very distinctive factor between a 16 valve 9A block and a ABA block. And it comes to do with how the oil pump is managed, as well as how the timing is managed on each motor. So quickly to briefly talk about one of the biggest changes. If you want to make an ABA with a 16 valve 9A head on it, you have to do this change, and I'll show you why, and it's to do with the intermediate shaft. And I also want to say that if you're building an ABA or ABF motor, this is an absolute must. So we'll talk about each thing and I'll show you real quick. So intermediate shaft, not only is the pulley smaller, but its function is the most important part. On a ABA motor, actually on an 8 valve motor, whether it's a 1.8 or an 2 liter ABA, the functionality of the intermediate shaft is the same. The intermediate shaft, and I've put it back in to show you guys what I mean, but on this end of the intermediate shaft is obviously timed with the timing belt. So it ensures that the camshaft timing that's up here as well as the intermediate shaft are timed together in rotation with the crank. Now what happens is I'm gonna have to try multiple hands here to show you guys, but inside of this hole here, hopefully you can see that. There you go. You can see this gear. If I spin this intermediate shaft, you can see that gear inside there is spinning. Now, on the bottom of a distributor, you have this gear here. This gear meshes with the intermediate shaft gear. So as this gear spins, which inside of this distributor times which cylinder is getting spark, which is in turn timed to the timing belt by the intermediate shaft. When these two things turn, it keeps it in sync. The key ingredient here is if you look down in the hole, you see that little, right here, there's that little straight tab. At the bottom of the distributor, there's a straight tab as well. So as this turns, it turns that little tab. So that little tab there is actually the drive for the oil pump. So as this intermediate shaft spins this gear, spins this little drive in the bottom, which turns the oil pump. Absolutely necessary in a motor to have oil pressure. You need to have this spinning. Why I bring all this up is because right here on a 16 valve is a block off plate, which I'll show you in a minute, and the distributor is on the side of the head. The distributor is timed the same method, except for rather than being timed with a belt, it's directly driven, similar setup, oh sorry, my light's ringing, a similar setup as this, but it's directly driven more or less by the camshafts. So you're having a direct drive there, so there's no need for a belt to link the two. That being said, there's now nothing that's powering that tab to spin because that gear isn't there anymore. So there's a difference there in the 9A when you go, sorry, give me a second to get the lights there. The 9A setup is different because there is, sorry, this is the plug that goes in there, and it's got a little bellows that holds the vibration. Now this doesn't want to come out, but it moves slightly to meet up with the top of that. But the point being, when you look in there, you can see that there's now a gear on top of that that meshes directly with the intermediate shaft. So now if I spin, again, trying to do all this one-handed, if I spin the intermediate shaft on this motor, you'll see that the oil pump drive drives. So without the distributor being here, you need to have this gear-driven oil pump. And as you can see, and you also need to have this intermediate shaft that meshes with that gear to drive it, as well as the wider 16 valve or 9A pulley that goes with the 9A head pulley that goes with the 9A crank. All need to be together because the belt is wider. So you can see how that is. So I need to take out this oil pump that's in this motor. As long as it's clean, I'll take a look at it and inspect it. We're going to take this intermediate shaft, we're going to take this gear and the oil pump out of the bottom and take all that and put it into this motor in replace of this oil pump. And then we're going to put that cap back on top here, and that'll give us a ABA motor, or ABA bottom end, sorry, that has a driven oil pump by the intermediate shaft. Make sense? Okay, let's get to work. And there we go, guts of the 9A. Pretty simple stuff. Let me show you here real quick. So we got the intermediate shaft from the 16 valve 9A. Right here is the gear that slips on. You can see how this is different. On an 8 valve, this is just a tab on the top. The 16 valve has a gear driven oil pump. This gear just slips on top. And when it sits in the block, it sits in the proper location. And then actually, oops, stop dropping that, it's probably not healthy. There we go. And then, so this sits like that, and then this actually sits right on top and kind of guides that position and holds it, so it stops it from moving around forward and back in the block. It holds it in proper rotation for the bearings and stuff, so it's nice. Gotta have this plug, gotta have this drive, gotta have this 16 valve oil pump if you intend on putting a 16 valve in or head on top of an ABA block. Now, again, one more thing is you're gonna ask me, well, is it necessary for me to change this intermediate shaft, knowing that this is relatively the same? Yes, it is. You do have to change it, and the reason why is, I probably blocked it off, but the way this pulley, which is the 16 valve one and the one you need, this pulley mounts differently to this shaft. It's the way it's set up. You can't put this 16 valve pulley on an 8 valve intermediate shaft. The keyway and everything is a little different. So in order to accept this pulley, which you need, it has to be on a 16 valve intermediate shaft. All right, so now that I've got the bits from the 16 valve that I need for this ABA, this ABA is relatively stripped down. I'm gonna leave the oil pump in it for now until I get parts, just so I don't tear this down too much. I'm gonna quickly measure the bore so I know what pistons to order. Then we're gonna go through quickly all of what I need here, what I need from this particular setup, and then what the intention is I'm gonna lay it out on the floor so you guys can see it all in entirety. Okay, so I've assembled what we kind of more or less need. So we'll start from the top. You got the 2-liter ABA bottom end. Again, we're going to be replacing the pistons with newer high compression ones. Running this setup is a 8.5-to-1 compression with the 16 valve head. If we use the 9A 2-liter 16 valve pistons in here, you'll get 9.5-to-1. But again, not exactly what I'm looking for a naturally aspirated setup. So we'll be changing pistons out. Then we have 16 valve exhaust header. Obviously I'll be cleaning that one up, but we're going to be using that one. We got the 16 valve head. I have it wrapped from the previous episode with the 16 valve pulley on there. And you can see what I have right here is the 16 valve distributor. I'll probably be using all new guts, new wires, that sort of thing. But you can see right here is the drive that drives the distributor. And you can see right there is where that keyway lines up. So like I was discussing before, that's how the distributor on a 16 valve is timed properly, because this this cam that runs right through here connects to this. So that's how you're going to get proper distributor timing because they're all linked. So that's a 16 valve distributor and plug wires. I'll be ordering new guts for that. You have the 16 valve oil pump, which I just explained, 16 valve intermediate shaft, 16 valve pulley. You got the block off plate for the distributor in the ABA block. You got the gear that drives the two together, as well as a clamp that holds it down. Then we have the engine mount. We have the ABA serpentine belt bracketry that holds the alternator, the tensioner, and that sort of stuff to be able to run the serpentine pulley on the ABA with the 16 valve head. Got some of the tin work, which I may or may not be using, depends on how the layout is. I forgot to mention before, but for the same reason you need the wider intermediate shaft pulley, you also need the crank pulley off the 9A. So I've got that set up as well. You can see the difference. I'll show you real quick. The difference in the width is quite substantial. And that again is to accommodate for the belt width that you put on there. Obviously not going to be using this water pump, but I wanted to highlight the fact that you need the 16 valve coolant outlets and the layout for the 16 valves. So you're going to need the 16 valve coolant tube. You're going to need both basically temperature outlets that bolt to the head, because you can't use the 2-liter routing because the locations of these locations are different on a 2-liter than they are on the 16 or on the 8 valve than they are on a 16 valve. Obviously I'm going to get a new water pump, so we won't worry about that. You got the timing belt idler from a 16 valve. Again, I'm going to be getting a new one, but I just left that there to show you. And then back in the 16 valve teardown episode, I showed you this oil cooler from Europe. I'll be using this on this build. Different than what you're going to get on a factory 16 valve or a factory ABA. I'm going to be running this setup. So difference is, let me just grab this. Here's the two setups. So this is a standard factory 8 valve, 16 valve type setup. So you're going to get the oil comes through here. This is a cooler that uses engine coolant through a bunch of veins in here to cool the oil as it goes through. The filter obviously is on the bottom here. So that's how the oil is cooled. It's cooled by, oh now I'm dripping oil over my floor. It's cooled by engine coolant in this setup, and it's got a sandwich cooler that sits in there. In this case, rather than having the sandwich cooler that goes on the bottom, the oil goes out through these lines, out one, in the other after it's cooled, and through the filter. Actually, I think it's the other way around. It goes through the filter, through the cooler, and back into the engine. Or maybe I have that wrong. Regardless, this is the engine oil cooler. Obviously needs a big cleanup. That'll go in the front of the car. So, with that discarded, other than that, all of this stuff here, that's all 8 valve bits. I'm not going to need any of that stuff. As well as the 16 valve AB or 9A block, won't be using that either. So there we go. So all of this stuff is more or less discarded. I'll probably sell some of it. And this stuff here is all the stuff we're going to be using. So in summary, we're more or less set up. I got a ton of gaskets to order. Got to order new water pump or coolant hoses. I'll order new setup there. I will order new head gaskets, intermediate shaft O-rings, you need distributor plug-off O-rings, all kinds of gaskets and stuff. We'll need new head studs and nuts for this intake manifold or exhaust manifold. I will be running a block off, so there is a freeze plug, there you go, a freeze plug in that hole, and I'll show you that kit when it comes time to installing it. Right here and this has to do with the management, but right here, I took it out for now, but I'll be probably putting it back. There's a crank trigger that goes in here on a 2-liter ABA. Whether you use it or not, you have to put it back. You can choose to cut the pigtail off and just leave the unit there, just so it doesn't leak, but you can't obviously run without it. You can have a hole in the side of your block. But I have taken it out because we're gonna clean this whole block down. We're gonna paint it, we're gonna freshen everything up. New gaskets everywhere, new seals everywhere. We're gonna get new head studs, all that sort of stuff. So lots of ordering to come. But again, it's just a whole bunch of minor, small parts. As far as the whole section there, we just have all the bigger bits we need, except for the carbs, which the carbs will be ordering brand new. Well, there we go, guys. Hopefully that explains to you, the basics of the ABF build that I'm going to be doing. Again, like I said before, you can choose to go different routes. You can choose to use different parts. There is a multitude of ways you can go instead of the way that I'm going. But this is the way I'm choosing to go. Keep it simple. If you guys want to be able to replicate this build in the future, I want you to be able to achieve by getting the parts just through other Volkswagens, not making it too expensive, keeping it kind of simple. And again, big component change is whether you're going carbureted or fuel injected. So again, you're gonna have to make that decision on what works well for you. As far as transmission setup, got a couple to choose from, so we'll bridge that gap on another day. But as far as today goes, this is what we need. I'm gonna place the order for the parts, and then we'll dive into the car and continue to go on the car while we wait for the other parts to arrive. Well, thanks very much. That about wraps it up for today's episode. If you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to please leave them in the comment section. I'd love to answer any questions if you have any. I'd love to hear your feedback if you have some of that too. But thanks very much. That's about it for this week's episode. Till next time, take care.